Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will offer an update on the case of Gene Hackman. I'll go through a brief background because I've already covered this case in detail, offer an updated timeline of the incident, then offer my updated analysis. Gene Hackman was born in 1930 in California. He enlisted in the Marine Corps when he was 16 after lying about his age. In 1952, he moved to New York City and worked a number of odd jobs. In 1956, Gene attended an acting school in California, but was kicked out after a year because his instructors believed he had no talent. Determined to prove them wrong, Gene returned to New York City and worked more odd jobs as he continued to pursue a career in acting. His first noteworthy role was in the 1967 movie Bonnie and Clyde, but his big break was in 1971 with The French Connection. After this, Gene stayed busy in the movie business. He appeared in many films over the years, including The Poseidon Adventure, 3 Superman movies, Uncommon Valor, Hoosiers, Mississippi Burning, Unforgiven, The Firm, The Quick and the Dead, Crimson Tide, Enemy of the State, The Replacements, Behind Enemy Lines, Runaway Jury, and Welcome to Mooseport. In 2004, Gene Hackman retired due to concerns about his cardiac health. Gene was married to a woman named Faye Maltese from 1956 to 1986. They had 3 children together. In 1991, he married a woman named Betsy Arakawa, who was over 30 years younger than him. After Gene retired from Hollywood, he and Betsy moved to a gated neighborhood on Old Sunset Trail, northeast of Santa Fe, New Mexico. They had 2 mansions on 12 acres and lived in the larger of the 2. For the most part, Gene maintained a reclusive lifestyle. He was last seen in public in March 2024, going to a medical appointment. Now moving to the timeline of the incident. On February 26, 2025, at 1:43 p.m., 2 maintenance workers contacted the police and said they found 2 dead bodies at Gene Hackman's mansion. When the police arrived, they found the bodies of Gene and his wife Betsy partially mummified. It appeared as though they had been dead for a while. Gene's body was in a mudroom off the kitchen. Betsy's body was on a bathroom floor. There was a bottle of prescription thyroid medication on a nearby countertop with pills scattered around it. About 10 to 15 feet away from Betsy's body, a German Shepherd named Xena was dead inside a crate. Recently, the dog had a medical procedure which could explain why she was in there. 2 other dogs were found alive on the property. There were no signs of forced entry into the mansion. The fire department could not identify any signs of a carbon monoxide leak or any type of poisoning. Later, it was reported that 1 small leak was found on a stove, but it was insignificant. On March 7, 2025, 9 days after the discovery of the bodies, the authorities gave a press conference and revealed what they found during the course of their investigation. Here's what they reported. On February 9, 2025, 17 days before the bodies were discovered, Betsy picked up the German Shepherd Xena from a veterinary hospital. 2 days later, on February 11, Betsy engaged in an email exchange with her massage therapist at 11:21 a.m. Betsy shopped at a farmer's market from 3:30 p.m. to 4:15 p.m. She then went to a CVS store. At 4:54 p.m., she stopped at a pet food store. At 5:15 p.m., Betsy accessed the gate of her neighborhood. On that same day, she had several unopened emails on her computer. From this point on, there was no more outgoing communication from Betsy. The authorities believe that Betsy died that same day, February 11, 2025. An autopsy indicated that 65-year-old Betsy died from Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS. Her manner of death was natural. HPS is an infectious disease carried by rodents. I will talk more about this disease in my analysis. The autopsy did not find any signs of internal or external trauma. Betsy had not been poisoned by carbon monoxide. Tests for influenza, COVID-19, and other common respiratory viruses came back negative. There were no other significant natural disease findings. The thyroid medication, which had been scattered near her body, did not represent a contributing factor to her death. The autopsy results for Gene Hackman indicated that he died from cardiovascular disease, with Alzheimer's disease as a significant contributing factor. He had been suffering from severe heart disease, had multiple surgical procedures involving his heart, evidence of prior heart attacks was found, and there were severe changes to his kidneys due to chronic high blood pressure. The Alzheimer's disease was advanced, and there were blood vessel changes in his brain due to the chronic high blood pressure. Gene had not been poisoned by carbon monoxide, he did not have any respiratory viruses, and there were no acute findings of internal or external trauma. Gene did not have hantavirus. On February 18, 7 days after Betsy died, Gene Hackman's pacemaker detected an abnormal rhythm of atrial fibrillation. There was no record of heart activity after that. The authorities believe that 95-year-old Gene Hackman died on February 18, 2025. Now moving to my analysis. As I mentioned, Betsy Arakawa died from hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS. This is a rare infectious disease that is carried by different types of rodents. In North America, the most common carrier is the deer mouse. This is the prime suspect in the case of Betsy's death. The virus can be transmitted from rodents to humans, but not normally from one human to another. Human-to-human transmission has only been documented in one virus strain, which is found in South America. Usually, the infection is caused by a person inhaling the virus, which is in the feces, urine, or saliva of rodents. A common scenario would involve rodent urine contaminating dust in a place like a barn, a basement, an attic, or a garage. When a person sweeps up the dust or vacuums the dust, it becomes airborne, and they inhale it along with the virus. Buildings or structures which are infrequently used have a greater risk of rodent visitors, like a shed or seasonal cabins. In addition to inhalation, the virus can be transmitted by being bitten or scratched by an infected rodent, eating contaminated food, or touching something contaminated, then touching one's eyes, nose, or mouth. Typically, HPS symptoms start in about 2 to 3 weeks. The first stage of the illness, which can last for several days, is characterized by flu-like symptoms including muscle aches, a headache, fatigue, fever, and chills. Some people also have stomach pain, nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea. The second stage of the illness usually begins 4 to 10 days after the start of the first stage. It features irregular heart rate, low blood pressure, shortness of breath, and coughing. Ultimately, the infection can lead to fluid building up in the lungs and heart failure. HPS is extremely dangerous and has a high mortality rate. 30 to 50% of those infected will die. Many of the victims of this infection have been farmers, hikers, campers, and the homeless. There is no specific treatment for HPS. Patients are typically hydrated and provided with breathing support if necessary. Between 1993 and 2022, there have been 864 cases of HPS in the United States. Many of the infections occurred in the Four Corners region. This is where the states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. With this in mind, let's move to the deaths of Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy. At first, this case was perplexing and mysterious. A famous actor and his much younger wife were found dead in a mansion with no obvious explanation. It didn't appear as though anybody had broken in and killed them. There were no signs of trauma, and no one called for help. How could this happen? One popular theory, which I talked about in my first video, was that Gene died from some type of cardiac event, which led to Betsy dying from an overdose of pills, like she could not bear to live after realizing her husband was dead. This theory was supported by the medication scattered on the counter near Betsy and the fact that both Betsy and Gene had died with no one calling 911. What are the chances that two people would die in the same house from separate conditions, neither of which was self-inflicted? Well, the risk of that is very low, but that is exactly what happened. Betsy died first from hantavirus. A week later, Gene died from a heart condition. The medication scattered on the counter near Betsy's body was unrelated to the tragedy. Given the available information, what do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. The mansion where Gene and Betsy lived did not have a rodent problem. The authorities said the risk of becoming infected with hantavirus in that mansion was low. The problem is there were other structures on the property which did have signs of rodent entry. Deer mice were able to penetrate the structures and make deposits. Betsy must have cleaned one of these infrequently used structures and become infected with hantavirus. She probably had no idea that hantavirus even existed, much less was lurking about on her property. Betsy was originally from Hawaii. After marrying Gene, she lived with him in Montecito, California, until his retirement. Betsy was probably not that familiar with the specific risks of living in New Mexico. Despite becoming infected with hantavirus, she continued to be productive. Betsy cared for Gene, cared for the dogs, went to multiple stores, and communicated with her massage therapist. She lived her life as if she was not ill. Betsy must have had symptoms. Perhaps she thought that she had the flu or a cold. Either way, she certainly didn't believe that she had a life-threatening illness. HPS can cause sudden death. That's probably what happened in this case. As more severe symptoms developed, Betsy was caught off guard and ended up dying in her bathroom. The authorities do not believe that Betsy was alive on the bathroom floor for a long time. It wasn't like she was trapped there for days, too sick to call for help. Betsy's death put Gene in a terrible position. The couple did not have a caretaker, so he was on his own. Considering how Gene had advanced Alzheimer's disease, he probably did not understand that Betsy had died. He was unable to communicate with the outside world or did not realize that he needed to for his survival. He could not feed himself. His stomach was empty at the time he died. Gene, however, was not dehydrated, so he must have continued drinking even after his wife died. Despite the explanation offered by the authorities in this case, some people are skeptical about the circumstances surrounding the deaths. They keep going back to the low likelihood that two people would die within a week of each other with no causal relationship between the deaths. Based on the ages of Gene and Betsy, 95 and 65 respectively, the odds of their deaths being purely independent are low, about 1 in 900,000. Despite this, there are a few arguments that can be made here supporting the theory put forth by law enforcement. First, Gene was in very poor health. He was at a higher risk of dying than the average 95-year-old. Second, I would argue that the deaths of Gene and Betsy may not have been truly independent. I think that one death did increase the probability of the other. During the 7-day period between Betsy's death and his death, Gene was probably confused, hungry, and under a lot of stress. He may have realized that something was wrong, but did not know what it was. This tremendous stress could have worsened his already fragile condition. In this sense, the deaths were not independent. Instead, Betsy's death contributed to Gene's death. Gene was already near the end of his life, but without Betsy's sudden absence, he might have lasted longer than a week. Now moving to my final thoughts. The lesson learned in this case is about preparation. When Gene Hackman died, his net worth was $80 million. He could afford around-the-clock care. Yet it appears as though Betsy cared for him alone. Perhaps this was a labor of love. However, having some type of backup plan would have made sense. If nothing else, simply having a person check up on the couple every day would have been helpful. Even just contacting them by email or text message to make sure they were responding. This plan may have prevented part of this tragedy, like it may have stopped Gene from dying. It may have even prevented Betsy from dying, but there's no way to know. HPS is a peculiar disease in the sense that scientists don't know exactly why it kills some people, but not others. This particular virus may have been lethal for Betsy, no matter what she did. But medical care certainly could not have led to a worse outcome than dying. The Gene Hackman case is a sobering reminder that even the brightest stars, whose names are etched in cinematic history, are not immune to the cruel hand of fate. A great actor who for years shaped unforgettable characters with an intensity few could rival, spent his final days terrorized by confusion, plagued by hunger, and lost in solitude. His wife, and only source of support, had fallen victim to an invisible enemy lurking in the dust. In the movies, scripts are crafted to be edgy, clever, emotional, and inspiring. But in the real world, people rarely get to choose how the film of their life ends. Those are my thoughts on the case of Gene Hackman. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.